The More Show is in partnership with Ozark Mountain Publishing, taking readers beyond the unexplained.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms. The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting live from the UK and across the world online, you're now listening to the UK's only live alternative late-night talk show, and I'm Kevin Moore. For the next 3 hours, we'll be exploring, learning some spiritual teachings and life philosophies that will hopefully help you to grow in awareness and consciousness. On tonight's show, I'll be joined by two guests who are listed on the Watkins 2013 100th Most Spiritual Influential Living People. Steve Taylor on the first half and Maureen Williamson on the second half of the show. Both these guests are internationally acclaimed spiritual authors and lecturers. The phone lines will be open on the second and third part of each interview for you to interact with our guests. We are live every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. British Summer Time. And that's Monday, Wednesday and Friday, 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in America. I'm now joined by Steve Taylor, who is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Metropolitan University and author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. Steve is listed at number 38 on Watkins 2013 100 Most Spiritually Influential Living People. He has also recently been interviewed by Eckhart Tolle, who describes his work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present. Good morning, Steve. How are you doing, Steve? You okay?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you?
Very, very well, and it's great to have you on. Steve, how does your universities that you work at, how do they see you as, being this sort of top spiritual guru, and yet being a sort of a lecturer at the same time?
I don't know. That's a difficult question. I think they're glad that I'm bringing some promotion to the university and that my books, that universities are very interested these days in attracting promotion and attracting interest. So I think they're glad that I'm creating some interest in the university and in the courses at the university.
Yeah, I mean, I graduated myself a couple of years back from university, and I can't say many of the lecturers that I came across were very, spiritually open-minded in a sense. But then let's start off. Your number, 38. But I know that you don't see it as being number 38 on the Watkins 100, top spiritual gurus. I mean, you don't identify with yourself in that sense, do you?
Well, not really. I mean, yeah, for one thing, I don't really see myself as a spiritual teacher as such. I know some people do, but I see myself really as a psychologist. And specifically as a transpersonal psychologist, to use the correct terminology. Transpersonal psychology is the study of unusual states of consciousness, and it's a study of spirituality and religion and higher states of consciousness. So I certainly see myself as a psychologist who's investigating what you could call the farther reaches of human nature, unusual states of consciousness, the whole spectrum of human consciousness. So some psychologists are quite reductionist, quite materialistic. Some psychologists even see the mind as just simply the product of the human brain, simply the product of the working together of the neurons in the human brain. But I see the human mind as something much more all-encompassing and something much greater than that.
And Have you always had a belief in a sort of, if you want, let's start with the word God or the universe or, you know, the super consciousness or the source?
Well, actually, the word God, I don't like that word, actually, because my background is completely non-religious, very sort of secular background. And the word God, for me, has so many different interpretations to different people. And, you know, it can be very easily confused and very, very easily misinterpreted. I mean, obviously, for most people in the world, the term God refers to a kind of anthropomorphic entity who somehow controls and overlooks the world, who can somehow intervene in human affairs and can confer retribution or justice on human beings. And for other people, the term God may mean something more spiritual. It may refer to a divine energy or a force or a spirit which pervades the universe, which is fine for me. That second definition corresponds to my concept of spirit, if you like. But just because the word God is so different to so many different people, I tend to avoid it. I think it's quite a difficult term.
Quite a loaded word, yeah. I mean, you know, in your work, can you find... well, I was going to say that, can you find God without religion? But I think what I'm trying to say, can you find that connection with the source? Is the source, is that a better word for you to use, or?
Yeah, it's source, or there's actually an Indian term called Brahman, which I like, and Brahman refers to an all-pervading spirit force, a kind of spirit energy which pervades everything in the universe.
Yes. And then it leads on to that, the connectivity. We are all connected, we are all one.
Yeah, I mean, in the Hindu Vedanta tradition, which is expressed in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about Brahman, which refers to the all-pervading universal force, and also Atman, which is that force as it expresses itself in our being. So there's Atman inside us, and there's Brahman out there in space. But essentially, they are one. Brahman and Atman are the same. They're one and the same. So that expresses that there is this fundamental unity between us and the whole of the universe.
Okay. All right, well, many questions to get through. I mean, your work is so fascinating. It's sort of multi-platformed as well. So let's try to start from, you know, your latest book is Waking from Sleep, Why Awakening Experiences Occur and How to Make Them Permanent. So would you say from your psychology background that some awakening experiences are not permanent? Or do people actually understand that they've had an awakening experience as such?
Well, they can be both. In my book, Waking from Sleep, I specifically talk about temporary awakening experiences, which can last for a few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours, maybe even a few days, but usually after a certain amount of time, there's a shift back into our normal state of consciousness. And these temporary awakening experiences often occur when we're relaxing, they often occur after meditation, or when we're in contact with nature, or through activities such as dancing, playing music, during sex, during or after sex as well. And they are experiences of connection when we transcend the normal sense of being separate. We enter into a deep state of connection with our surroundings, with nature, with other people. And also the world becomes a much more real and much more alive place. Our surroundings seem to take on a new dimension of reality and become more beautiful. And also, the whole of our surroundings may seem somehow harmonious. There's a sense of meaning and harmony in everything. So those are temporary experiences. But in my book, following that, which is called Out of the Darkness, I move on to discussing permanent wakefulness, a permanent state of wakefulness. And there's a strong relationship between permanent spiritual awakening and turmoil and trauma. A lot of people undergo a shift into permanent spiritual awakening after periods of intense turmoil and suffering. So, for example, after periods of depression or confronting death through illness or even disability, or through the loss of a loved one, bereavement, or very sort of severe forms of loss. So that can often lead to a permanent state of spiritual awakening.
Okay, and I suppose once you've gone through a spiritual awakening process that has been quite traumatic in a sense, and they do tend to wake us up quite a bit, because I mean I've had my fair share of them as well, and I think that's what got us into doing this kind of show. You don't really understand what's going on to begin with, do you? You don't really understand. I mean, was this the case? Was this the same sort of case with yourself, where you found you couldn't sort of put your finger on what was happening at the time?
Yeah, that's true, especially when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, and also maybe in my early 20s. I'd had awakening experiences quite regularly, and they were always moments of exuberance and inner peace and perception of beauty and meaning. But because my background wasn't my sort of family environment wasn't a spiritual one. I had no sort of religion or spirituality in my background, so I didn't understand the experiences. So after a while I thought there was maybe something wrong with me, and that I was becoming different to other people around me, and I felt drawn to nature and to stillness and solitude. So that made me different to the people around me, the other people of my age. So I did begin to think there was possibly something a bit wrong with me. But it's only a bit later on, once I was in my early 20s, I felt drawn towards meditations, and I started to meditate. And I felt drawn to spiritual books, to books about mysticism and spiritual traditions. So slowly, it's a question of building a framework which allows you to make sense of your experience. Once you have that framework in place, once you have the map that tells you where you are and where you're going, then everything slots into place, and you realize, and I realized myself, what was really going on, and I did begin to make sense of these experiences.
And you also sort of become a bit more light-hearted as well, don't you? Things are, you become a bit more of a fun person to be around. You don't take yourself as seriously. You see life as a gift to sort of manifest what it is you want through life as well.
That's true. Yeah, certainly. You become less interested in pursuing sort of avenues of becoming more successful and gaining more possessions. Life becomes less competitive, and it becomes less serious, because events don't tend to affect you to the same degree. You develop an inner self-sufficiency, which makes you less affected by either negative or positive events around you. And so, you develop this kind of the strong inner compass and a strong sense of inner balance, which makes you less vulnerable to the vicissitudes of life. And also, there's a sort of a lightness and buoyancy. There's kind of an energy of innate buoyancy and well-being, which just sort of carries you lightly through the river of life.
You go with the flow.
Yeah, that's right. You become. I sometimes use that analogy, actually, because often in life we're trying to swim our way through the stream. We're forcing ourselves forward, trying to reach as far as we can. Sometimes it's best just to relax and stop swimming and just let the river carry you, just to float in the river and let it carry you where it wants to go, where it wants to take you.
Oh no, I really like that analogy, and I agree absolutely. So okay, we're just going to take a quick break, Steve, and we'll be right back after this.
The Moore Show is in partnership with Ozark Mountain Publishing, taking readers beyond the unexplained.
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the Moore Show website.
The Moore Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms.
Welcome back to the show. I'm currently joined by spiritual author of the book Back to Sanity, Steve Taylor. Steve, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi. Steve, for people who never have spirituality cross their path, are never religious, let's take atheists, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How are they improving their life, in a sense, by not embracing any conceptualization that there may be more to them than their body, there may be more to them than what they can perceive for when they pass on as well?
Well, I think actually a lot of people, even if they call themselves atheists, I think even some of those people experience what you could call spiritual moments sometimes. I think they may experience moments of awakening sometimes. I think a lot of people have awakening experiences in many everyday activities. I think a lot of people experience some form of awakening experience when they play certain sports, like probably if they go climbing, even if they go jogging, or sometimes in swimming. I think a lot of people are drawn to certain sports and certain activities because they can experience an element of wakefulness in these activities. But what tends to happen is that people tend to explain these experiences in biochemical or materialistic terms. So somebody who goes running, for example, may experience a state of well-being, a state of connection, but they'll explain it in terms of endorphins, sort of the pain and the stress of running producing endorphins. Or some people, when they go hang gliding or surfing, people often have some degree of awakening experiences when they do these activities. But again, they'll explain it in biochemical terms. So I think what happens is that some people with a materialistic mindset, they kind of deny their own experience by explaining it in biochemical terms, even though they still have the experience, but the atheistic or materialistic framework gives them a certain way of explaining reality, and they're usually not willing to let go of that framework.
But I wonder how they react to, well, not how they react, but it must be so difficult for them that, if life does continue, that when they do pass on, that maybe they look back and say, well, Christ, if only I'd had a second chance at this and, had done things different. Why did I waste my time? Or, well, actually, no, saying that, no life's a waste of time, is it? Every life, whatever anyone's going through, is important, but surely there's something missing with the way that we treat people. If spirituality brings understanding of oneness, the way that you treat how you treat others, you treat yourself, how loving yourself, that's an important part as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and also, there was a very interesting story in the news recently, just a few weeks ago. It was about a guy called Wilco Johnson, who was a guitarist in a band called Dr. Feelgood, who were quite successful in the 70s. And I think he's in his 50s now, I think he's in his early 60s now, and he's been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He's been told he only has 6 months left to live. And he talks about how being diagnosed with cancer has completely changed his conception of reality, and it's completely altered his state of mind and his view of the world. And he still calls himself an atheist, but he was talking about how now he has this amazing sense of presentness and how everything looks incredibly beautiful to him. And he talks about how throughout his life he has suffered from depression, and he's been a kind of guy who worries about things and feels resentment and feels bitterness about the past. But he said that all of that has suddenly disappeared from his mind. It's as if a great weight has suddenly been lifted, and now he feels this tremendous sense of ease and well-being in just living in the moment. So even though he only has a certain amount of time left to live, he feels incredibly grateful just to be alive for these moments. And to me, that's an example of somebody, he still calls himself an atheist, but he is certainly experiencing a powerful state of wakefulness. And that's certainly one of the things which many people miss, is that sense of ease, that sense of living easefully in the present. We're so preoccupied with the future, our minds are so busy with fairly trivial and inconsequential thoughts and responsibilities that we miss out on the glory and the ease that can come when you really live in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, that's an important part of your work as well, isn't it? It's being present, being in the moment.
That's right, yeah. I mean, one of my early books was a book called Making Time, and it was an analysis of why time seems to pass at different speeds in different situations.
Yeah.
But on one level, it was about how time is an illusion. There's really no such thing as time. There's really no such thing as a future. There's really no such thing as a past. All the future is it's an idea in your mind. It's an imagination. It's when you use your ability to anticipate, to project potential outcomes in the future. And the past is only a memory. It's only your memories of past events, and it's also maybe there are records of past events in writing or on video, but they don't exist. They're just constructs. They're just mental constructs. And all life really consists of is the river of the present, which you're always inside. You're always flowing with the river of the present, and there is never anything outside this moment. And this moment is always all there is. So if you can't be happy in this moment, if you can't feel contentment and fulfillment in this moment, then it doesn't exist, because fulfillment and peace can only ever exist in this moment.
Okay, Steve, I'm just going to ask you just to come a bit closer to the phone as well, because I keep losing your audio just a little bit. So,
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, being in the moment, like you say there, is so important, and I'm sure it's not easy for people listening to this to say, well, how can I stay in the moment when everything's falling to pieces sometimes? But it's like you say, the moment is all we have. But what some people call themselves spiritual, right? Yet, and they'll all the stuff that goes with that. Yet, in the moment, sometimes they can, they're either very angry people.
Mm-hmm.
They're very attached to, for example, stress, anger, judgmental as well.
Yeah.
You can't have your cake and eat it, can you? You can't call yourself spiritual, but not really. You're not acting it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, the term spiritual is such a... It's quite a difficult term in many ways, because it has such a different meaning to so many different people. For some people, the term spiritual refers to religion, and you can hear the Archbishop of Canterbury in the morning on the radio talking about his spiritual life, or the Christian spiritual life. Or some people, spirituality refers to psychic phenomena. It's sort of getting in contact with deceased relatives and so forth. And you also have books like The Secret and The Law of Attraction, when spiritual people try to attract positive events. They try to fulfill their desires or fulfill their ambitions. Whereas for other people, spirituality is about transcending desires and ambitions, and developing an inner contentment which stops them striving towards the future. So really there are so many different meanings of the term spiritual or spirituality, which is why nowadays I try more and more to avoid using the term, actually, and I talk about awakening and wakefulness instead.
Yeah, that's right. It's got a lot of connotations with it, hasn't it? It's got a lot of it's like the word God, isn't it? I mean, it's got the good stuff with it and the bad stuff, and it's just a word as well.
Yeah, that's right.
It is just a word. And this sort of leads on to the ego. I mean, in your work, you talk of the ego as being, you sort of identify the ego as a sense of attachment to worry, anger, stress, judgments, ambitions, wealth. Whatever it may be. Do you think the ego gets a bit of a hard time?
In a sense, I think it does. But again, I mean, you have to be clear about what you mean by the term ego. Literally, ego just refers to your sense of being an I, your sense of identity. And in a sense, we need a sense of I to function in the world. You need to have a sense of being a person. You need to be able to make decisions. You need to be able to organize your life, to plan and so forth. And all of those functions are performed by what you could call the ego, and they're quite necessary functions. And if you know, according to that definition, if your ego isn't working properly, if you don't have a sense of ego, then it's equivalent to being psychotic or suffering from schizophrenia.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, the ego is quite necessary. But the problem becomes, in my view, the problem comes when the ego becomes far too dominant, when it takes over our whole consciousness and it takes over our whole energy, our whole mental energy is fueled into the ego. And also because the ego often feels a sense of separateness and vulnerability, we collect attachments to try to bolster the ego, to give it some support. So that can be attachments such as material possessions, success and status and achievement and so forth. So we can spend a lot of our lives trying to accumulate attachments to support the ego, which has itself has a detrimental effect, and that can stop us gaining access or stop us getting in contact with the true self or the pure consciousness which lies beneath the ego, if you like. That's why it's interesting when people go through intense turmoil and suffering, because in those situations, the ego and all of its support, all of its building blocks, they fade away. All the support is taken away. And that's when our normal identity is sometimes destroyed by the turmoil and suffering. But it's almost as if a new identity arises, a kind of new awakened identity arises to take place of the old identity.
Right, so the ego is a sense of identity made up from our attachment to whatever it may be, attachment to worry, stress, and whatever the attachment may be. But I think what you're saying, being free and full from attachment of stress, worry, anger, ambition, wealth, can we experience? Well, we can sort of experience heaven on earth. Then is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, we can shift into a different state of identity, which isn't rooted in the ego, and it's almost as if there is a kind of latent higher self inside us. And you could even say it's a kind of, you could look at it from an evolutionary perspective and suggest that this latent higher self is the next state of being which evolution is heading towards. It's kind of like a higher state of being which is there in potential. And it's almost as if that's waiting to arise and take over our consciousness. But first of all, the old self, which is constructed from all of these attachments, that old self has to fade away. So when people go through intense suffering and turmoil, that old self is blown away, destroyed by the suffering, and this new self arises to become our normal self.
Can we dissolve the ego without a spiritual awakening, or are they sort of hand in hand?
Well, I think I think there are probably 2 or 3 different ways by which you can experience spiritual awakening. One is probably the most traditional way of moving towards spiritual awakening, which is following a spiritual path such as the path of Buddhism or the Kabbalah, or the teaching of a particular guru. And so that would involve certain spiritual practices and certain lifestyle guidelines, certain exercises which will have a psychological effect and which will change your state of being gradually over months or years. So that's a very a long-term cumulative process, and which most spirit that's the traditional idea of spiritual seeking, the traditional idea of spiritual development. And you could see that as a gradual movement beyond the ego. You're trying to tame the crazy restlessness of the human mind. You're trying to create a new psychological structure which brings you a different view of reality. And that it does involve transcending the normal sense of ego.
Okay, Steve, well, we're going to take a short break and we'll be back after this.
The Moore Show is in partnership with Ozark Mountain Publishing, taking readers beyond the unexplained.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines. Available for download on all major digital platforms.
Welcome back to the show. I'm currently joined by my guest, Steve Taylor, and we're discussing his 2 books, Back to Sanity, Healing the Madness of Our Minds, and Waking from Sleep While Awakening Experiences Occur, and How to Make Them More Permanent. Steve, welcome back.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello. Thank you for joining us again, Steve. I thank you for staying up as well, because I know right now, you know, it is what time we're on right now. Is it 2:14 in the morning here right now? So,
yeah.
And you're in the UK. What part of the UK are you in, Steve?
I'm in Manchester.
Oh right, you are. But you are in Manchester right now. Yeah, because that's where you're based permanently, aren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, I live in Manchester. I teach in Leeds at the university, but I live in Manchester, where it's raining as usual.
Yeah, but with your work, though, you get to go all over the world, don't you?
Yeah, I don't travel too much because I've got 3 young children.
Ah, right, yes.
So I don't like travelling too much, but yeah, I get a lot of invitations. Yeah, more and more. I'm starting to get more and more invitations to do workshops and give talks abroad. So occasionally, yeah, maybe 2-3 times a year I go abroad.
Did you ever think your life was going to go on this course?
Well, I did actually. I always knew from a young age that, well, for a start, I knew that I wanted to be a writer from the age of maybe 15 or 16, and and at the same age, I always knew that I had a deep-rooted interest in spirituality and awakening. So, you know, it's certainly over the last 10 years, my life has taken on the pattern that I always felt it should have, and I always felt that potentially it was going to take on this pattern. So, when I was a bit younger, there was sometimes an element of frustration because my life wasn't unfolding in the way that I innately felt it should do. But certainly over the last 10 years or so, I feel as though I'm on the path which I was always meant to be on. Right,
yeah. I mean, do you think you've lost your ego? I mean, is your ego not your sense of identity, or?
Well, you have to probably better to ask my wife about that. I couldn't possibly comment myself.
Yeah. Well, what must it be like living with a spiritual guru? I mean, did she marry one before, or has you always been there?
No. Well, she's my guru actually, because she makes sure that I never take myself too seriously.
Oh, right. So she keeps you grounded.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, and my children as well. You know, it's very. Young children are great because they really keep you grounded in the present moment. I always have this. Whatever is happening in my professional life, I always have this role as a father as well. You know, and I always have this role of playing with my children and having fun with my kids. So that really keeps me grounded and stops me getting too carried away in intellectual or spiritual matters. Keeps me grounded in the present moment.
Do you find it a big responsibility, your work?
No, not at all. No, I find it's really a question for me. It's really a question of allowing what's inside me to emerge naturally. So, in some sense, I feel as though I have to get out of the way to be able to come through. So, it's really a question of, in some ways, making myself empty, making myself blank, so that something, whether you call it creativity or a spiritual force, or a kind of creative spiritual force, I have to allow that to emerge inside me. And to some extent, I don't have to do anything to make that happen. In a sense, I have to stop doing anything to make it happen. I have to relax and empty myself out, as I say. So yeah, you know, I do sometimes feel as if, without sounding pompous, I'm a kind of channel for something which is coming through me, and it's my role is to, you know, to allow that to manifest itself.
Yes. No, that sounds about right on this show. Absolutely. But you don't sound like someone that gets bored neither. And why do human beings get bored so easy, so sort of dissatisfied?
Well, I think I mean, in my book, Back to Sanity, I talk about this psychological disorder, which I think most human beings suffer from, and I call it humania. And humania's got two basic characteristics. One is the sense of separateness, which we've talked about, the sense which many human beings have of being separate entities enclosed in their own mental space. So we have a sense that I'm in here, inside my mental space, the rest of the world is out there. So there's a sense of separateness and duality, and also a sense of incompleteness, because people feel that they are kind of like a broken off fragment, which is not part of the whole cosmos, which has kind of been broken off from the whole of reality. So that's one characteristic. The second characteristic is what I sometimes call cognitive discord, and that's the sheer restlessness of our minds. You know, when our minds are not focused on an external activity, when they're not absorbed, they tend to chatter away and fill with associations about they fill random memories about the past, daydreams, and random fragments of songs or conversations that we've heard recently. And it's quite chaotic. The mind in itself can be quite a chaotic and restless place. And so I think when people feel boredom, what they're actually experiencing is humania. They're experiencing the separateness of the ego, and they're experiencing the cognitive discord of their minds. And that's why they feel the urge to focus their minds on an activity or to immerse it in a distraction, just so that they can get away from the discord in their minds.
And as well with sort of, you know, boredom and touching on dissatisfied people. Sorry, get the words out there. We also have to, you know, make sure that we always, you know, remain in the present moment as well, which is something I'm struggling with speaking to you right now, because there's so many questions I'm looking at on my sheet of paper that I'm not being centered right now, even with you, right? So I'm just going to be, you know, let's be honest about it. Because I just want to ask you something that no one's asked you, but do you know what, this is, I don't think I need to in this particular case, because I think, you know, with our particular audience, this will be new to them anyway. Because I mean, as someone that gets interviewed a lot, I mean, do you ever get, you know, dissatisfied when you don't, you know, it's always the same kind of question, isn't it? Or is that something you've just got to do as an author as well?
No, I never get dissatisfied. I mean, certainly nowadays, authors, you know, if you're an author, the role of writing is certainly just one aspect of it. There's a lot more promotion, especially in the social media and through Facebook and Twitter. You know, most publishers expect authors to have a big Facebook following and a big following through Twitter. So I sometimes find those kind of promotional activities a bit onerous, because really, if you're an author or a teacher, you want to spend most of your time writing or teaching. But authors nowadays have to focus more and more on Facebook interactions, which I enjoy in itself. But
yes,
fundamentally, I want to immerse myself in writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this channel that speaks through you as well. What's some of the most recent conversations you have? I mean, is there always a sort of conversation on where you're going with your journey, or is it sort of, you know, you do your work for the collective good? So you're talking about bigger issues like, you know, where we are with evolution on Earth and subjects like that.
Yeah. Well, it's not really. It's not like. What you would maybe call traditional channeling, where I hear a voice and I write down what the voice says to me. It's much vaguer and much less. It's more like a kind of a strong impulse rather than anything else. It's kind of like a creative impulse which flows through me, and somehow it also fills me with a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, and sometimes it manifests itself in poetry. I sometimes have a strong impulse to write poetry or to formulate ideas or insights in a poetic way. I think for me, fundamentally, it is connected to evolution. I certainly feel that my purpose is to try to further the evolution of human consciousness. I've always felt that very, very strongly from deep down inside me, that my role is to try to encourage the development of human consciousness so that we can move into a new phase of evolution.
And that moves me to your newest, is it your newest book, The Meaning, the Poetic and Spiritual Reflections?
That's right, yeah, that was published a few months ago.
Okay, and again, this is poetry that when you've been on your travels, you've used the word channel, but this has come through you, and this is poetry that you've had published.
Yes, well, I did write poetry when I was younger, when I was a teenager, but I stopped for a long time. But about 6 or 7 years ago, poems seemed to naturally form inside me. They weren't exactly channeled as such, but a certain impulse would form inside me, and I'd have a few lines or a fragment of a few verses or images would form in my mind, and I'd feel a strong impulse to write it down and form it into a poem. And often it came from my own awakening experiences. I felt an impulse to try to depict or try to frame my own awakening experiences. So that manifests itself in poems. And so eventually, after 3 or 4 years, I had enough poems to publish as a small book. And there's a very long tradition of spiritual poetry. A lot of gurus and mystics have also been poets. And a lot of the most famous poets in English literature, or also the world literature, have also been very spiritually developed people like Wordsworth or D.H. Lawrence, William Blake, and so forth. So there's always been a very strong connection between spiritual awakening and poetry. So I see my own poems in that same tradition.
Yeah. And I didn't get a chance to read the actual Poetic and Spiritual Reflections, but I did get a chance to read your other books, and I've got to highly recommend them. But I love the one Waking from Sleep, and there was another one before that as well that I got a chance to read, which where was it called? The Fall. That was it. The Insanity of the Ego in Human. I can't read my writing there, but it's called The Fall, yeah. And just the beginning part as well, the history of the ego, and because you'd gone around the world to see these cave paintings and everything, and there was no war, was there? There was no violence in some of these paintings, which I thought was marvelous. That you'd sort of put this together.
Yeah, the basic idea of that book is that the ego, as we know it nowadays, is a relatively recent development, that it only really formed a few thousand years ago. And before then, human beings had a much weaker or much less individuated sense of identity. They felt a very strong connection to nature. They were less separated off from their surroundings. And also, not uncoincidentally, during that phase of human history, before about 4000 BC, the archaeological record shows very little evidence of warfare, and there's also very little evidence of social oppression or conflict between different groups, very little evidence of hierarchical societies. That only comes later, once the ego becomes stronger and more separated. It also manifests itself in warfare and social oppression, and also in the oppression of women. That's another interesting thing about these earlier cultures. They were very reverential towards women. Women had completely equal status. And it was only later on, once the ego developed, that women became dominated and oppressed by men.
Do you think if people embrace some of your, I'll call them teachings in a sense, in regards to the ego, to transforming of the ego, that the world would become a peaceful place overnight?
Certainly, yeah. There's a strong connection between the discord in the human mind and the discord in the world. There will only ever be peace in the world once there is some degree of peace in human beings. So warfare is really only an expression of the separate, strongly developed ego, and many other of the kind of pathologies which fill human history, such as the oppression of women, and even monotheistic religions are related to this too. They can all be traced back to the separateness of the ego. So once that separateness is transcended, then most of these pathologies are transcended too, and we move into a more harmonious more peaceful world.
Okay. Now, Steve, you do online courses as well, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Okay. And how can people find out more about the online courses? Obviously, what's your website address?
Yeah, my website is www.stephenmtaylor.co.uk. So that's Stephen with a V, stephenmtaylor.co.uk. Yeah, no, I regularly run online courses based on my book, Back to Sanity. I think the next one is starting in mid-June, so people can just log on to my site to get the information about that.
Okay, and also I believe there's something with Hay House that you're doing. Is it next week with the?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yes, with the other. Yeah, it's is it online only? An online only sort of course?
Yeah, it's called the Hay House World Summit, and it's 110 spiritual authors and teachers are giving interviews and holding conversations from June the 1st to June the 10th, and I think my interview is being broadcast on June the 8th.
Okay, but we'll put a link on our website for that as well, and for your site and your books and everything else. So, Steve Taylor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, stay tuned, as after the break I'll be joined by internationally acclaimed spiritual author and lecturer, Mary Ann Williamson.
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the More Show website.